Today we're gonna go through confusing things your Pilates instructor says and what they actually mean. Because the hardest thing when I started with Pilates was the jargon that instructors use, and I would look around so confused, unclear of what they actually wanted me to do. So I've jotted down some notes here and we're gonna go through common things they say and what they actually mean by them. First one is by far the most important one for you to understand, and that is a neutral spine. Your neutral spine is when your spine is most supported by your anatomy. It helps protect your low back, it helps protect your spine overall, so it's something you definitely wanna be familiar with. The best way to describe it is your spine when it is without an interior or posterior tilt to it, where it's pretty straight along the surface that you're lying on. So what I like to tell people when it comes to finding neutral is play around with moving their pelvis forward and backward and start to see which one feels most comfortable with your low back closest to the mat. So for example, if I'm lying here with my ankles underneath my knees, if I tilt my pelvis down, my pubic bone down towards the floor, I feel this compression in my low back and I feel this big lift behind my low back. If I were to pull my pubic bone all the way up, I feel really crunched up here and I'm imprinting my spine. My neutral is somewhere in between where my spine feels the most comfortable. So definitely be familiar with the term neutral spine. Another one I hear a lot and use a lot, quite honestly, is the C curve. And this is a shape that we want you to create with your spine. This is when you're hollowing out your abdominals, you're drawing your belly button up and back towards your spine, and you're creating a C curve to your spine. What a lot of people misunderstand with the C curve is they think this is a C curve, just like completely rounding over. But that's not actually what your instructor wants. What your instructor wants is initiating through your tailbone. So imagine you were trying to tuck a tail between your legs. You would tuck under and you would find that C curve shape while keeping your core braced. So this is a great foundational move to be comfortable with. A lot of times, sometimes you'll have a ball between your low back, and that's when they're telling you to find that C curve against the ball. So it starts from your tailbone, and it is that C shape that you create with your spine. Let's talk about brace core, which is another one that I feel like everyone should explain during your first Pilates class, but a lot of people don't. It is the idea of engaging your abdominals, essentially. How to brace your core is a lot of what we've already talked about. It's that idea of pulling your belly button in towards your spine, so drawing everything up. Another analogy I love to use is imagine you're lying on the floor. If a toddler was about to jump on your stomach, to protect your internal organs, you would tense up. So you would tense up those muscles and make your abs tight to protect your stomach when they were about to step on you. So that's the same idea of what you want to do here. So you want to think about bracing your core. When your core is braced, you should still be able to breathe really well. So you should be able to take a nice inhale and exhale. You're not sucking the air out, so it's not sucking in like where you're changing the shape of your shoulders and everything's tensing up. Instead, it's just a belly button into your spine, boop, and we're braced. Another one you'll hear a lot is tabletop position. So this is usually in reference to your knees, and that is when usually your knees are in line with your hips and your ankles are in line with your knees. So tabletop position will look something like this. Pretty simple. The idea is if you needed to, you could sit something right on top of your shins and it would sit like a table. So this is your tabletop position. Another one that's used a lot is square. This is usually in reference to your hips or your shoulders. This basically means we want things to be stacked in one line together. So square shoulders would be both of my shoulders pointing towards this direction. Square hips would be both of my hips pointed this direction. And both my shoulders right now are stacked and my hips are stacked. So two different terms. One is square and one is stacked. And sometimes they're used together, like in this position, where I have both of my hips square towards the camera, both of my shoulders square towards the camera, but I also have one shoulder stacked on top of the other and one hip stacked on top of the other. This is what unstacked hips would look like. So my hips are open, one's pointing here, one's pointing there. Another thing I like to use as an analogy is if you imagine you have some laser beams pointing out through your hips or your shoulders, you would want both of them to equally point at the wall. Or another way to think about it is if you imagine you draw a line from your hips to the wall, it would create a square. So that is a concept of square, but also the concept of stacking. Another one that tripped me up when I started, the pubic bone. I guess I didn't really think about my pubic bone a lot, but you will hear oftentimes in Pilates a reference to your pubic bone. Everyone has one. That is the bone right here. So if I'm telling you to point your pubic bone up, right here, I want you to lift and point it up. If I'm telling you to point it down, it's this way. So this is your pubic bone. Oftentimes when we're engaging our abdominals, your instructor will tell you to scoop out your abs, like scoop back. And that one also confused the heck out of me when I started. If you think about it, it's the idea of pulling your belly button back and up. So you're scooping as much of your abdominals out. This is often used when you brace your core. So that's something that you want to think about, that scooping. And if you imagine, I'm a very visual person, as you'll learn from me on this channel. I like to imagine if I was trying to make my body a little spoon that I would be scooping some ice cream up with, I would want everything to be curved back together and pressed down. So this is a scoop shape. A lot of times when they're telling you to scoop your abs out, they want you to pull your abs, draw them in and back. How to bring out a prop for this one, because this is one that comes up a lot. A lot of times your instructor, myself included, will say heavy on the ball. And this is usually when we're using a Pilates ball as a prop. What we mean by that, and that's usually activating your C curve and finding that abdominal engagement. But what we mean is if you're heavy on the ball, you have a lot of pressure on that ball, right? So you're keeping that ball in place. Your pubic bone is tilted up. So you're heavy on it. You're sitting back into it. Everything's scooped out. Core is tight. If you're not heavy on that ball, you're lifted away from the ball, someone could just knock the ball out from under you. So you really want to stay heavy. Another analogy I like to say during my classes is imagine I was about to come behind you and I was trying to steal that ball from you. I want you to push really hard against that ball, keep it in place, keep your abdominals pulled in, and that is staying heavy on the ball. Powerhouse is one of my least favorite Pilates terms. I think that's an OG Joseph Pilates term, but essentially it just means this region, your trunk. I think there's a lot of better ways to say it, but powerhouse is something that you'll hear a lot of instructors talk about. It's usually thought of where the energy starts from or where the power starts from is from this powerhouse region. Another one I personally love is the idea of energy through, and that could be used for any limbs. Basically, when I say energy through, I want you to have energy through your fingertips. I want your arm to be really strong with the motion. So I don't want you limp here. I don't want you just flailing your arms around. Same could go for your leg. I want energy through your leg. I don't want your leg limp here if you're swinging it back and forth. I want energy. So everything's pretty tight, leg is extended, muscles are engaged. This is what energy through my fingers and energy through my leg would look like. Oftentimes it includes a point. So that's what we mean by energy through. Let's talk about another least favorite cue, and that is knitting your ribs together or closing your ribs. This is very often used by instructors, and I honestly think it's one of the most confusing terms. So I'll show you more so what it looks like. Oftentimes when we're doing abdominal moves, your ribs will pop open because you're trying to compensate in other places of your body. So when we say close your ribs or knit your ribs together, we want to pull everything back. And again, that goes back to having a really good solid braced core. So when you think about having your ribs open, say if we're doing something lying down on our back, I'm seeing your ribs pop up. I'm gonna tell you to knit your ribs together, pull everything tight, and that is gonna allow you to better activate through your abdominals. So that's what the idea of knitting your ribs together. From the side, it would look something like this. So open ribs usually look like this, closed together ribs, everything comes really close. We pull it in through our abdominals. Hinge is usually used to help you understand where you should be initiating motion of that movement from. So you're imagining that body part, it's usually in reference to like an elbow, a knee, a hip, is a hinge and a door. You're swinging something out one way and you're bringing it in, but it's all coming through that joint. So for example, from my elbow, if I were to hinge my wrist out, hinge from my elbow, I would go in and out, in and out. If I were to hinge through my shoulders, say in maybe a plank position, that would look something like this. I would have my elbows underneath my shoulders. I would hinge myself forward and back, forward and back, forward and back. For side lying, if I were to hinge through my hips with my ankle, I would hinge forward and back. Everything starting through my hip, forward and back. So that's the use of the term hinge. Last one is articulate, and this is usually used in reference to your spine, oftentimes when you do a bridge position. And this is just to tell you to move one vertebrae at a time. So you're articulating. Another great analogy I like to use for this one is if you imagine you have a string of pearls down on the table. If I want you to articulate that string of pearls, you're gonna pull one string of pearl up, or one pearl at a time is how you're gonna lift the pearls, and you're gonna lower one pearl at a time. Same way you would think about your spine. So if you were to articulate through your spine from a bridge position, you would roll up through your tailbone. I'm trying to go one vertebrae at a time, so I'm not going straight up. I'm going one vertebrae at a time. We lift, 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 and then we lower, lower, lower. One movement at a time. So really trying to get you to isolate your movement. Those are all the common terms that you often hear during Pilates classes that are sometimes confusing for newbies. Let me know if you have any others, and I can make a part 2.